Today we're going to talk about graphing lines. So just as a little recap from what we learned in our previous lesson, the generic equation for a line is y equals mx plus b. So the m stands for the slope, and it tells you how to get to the next point. And the b stands for the y-intercept, which is where the graph crosses the y-axis. Now the x and the y are there because the equation of a line lets you calculate the location of any point on a line, and a point has coordinates x and y. So it has to have an x and a y so that you can get a coordinate out of it if you try. So our slope, which is telling me how to get from point to point, follows the format either rise over run, or, if it makes more sense to you, delta y over delta x. Delta means change, so it's the change in the y value divided by the change in the x value. So the y value is our up and down part, and the x value is our side to side part. Now for the y-intercept, it is just where it crosses the y-axis, and there isn't really a special formula or anything for that. So today we're going to be looking at how do I take an equation and actually graph it ourselves. So our question here says graph each of the following lines, state the slope, y-intercept, and x-intercept for each. Now we have not talked about x-intercept yet. That's going to be something new that we do today. So our first example says y equals 2/3 x plus 4. And you'll notice it has a place for us to write down the y-intercept, the slope, and then the x-intercept, and it does say underneath that we are going to get that from the graph. So we have to graph it first, and then we should be able to fill that part in. So when I'm looking at my equation, if I'm looking for the y-intercept, that's the number that does not have a variable next to it, which is going to be the positive 4. And then when I'm looking for the slope, that's the number that comes in front of the x, which in this case is 2/3. So when I go to graph this, the easiest place to start is the y-intercept. Once I have a point on the graph, I can use the slope to help me find other points on the graph, but I need somewhere to start. So our starting point is going to be that y-intercept, which is why it's also called the initial value, which we learned in Unit 2, because it's where we're going to start. So I'm going to start on the y-axis at 4, and I'm going to make a point. Now from here, I need to use the slope. Now the slope is rise over run, or the up and down over the side to side. So this is my delta y, that's how the y value is changing, and this is delta x. So this is how the x is changing. So to my y values, I'm going to add 2. So if I start here on the up and down part, I'm going to add 2. So 4 plus 2 is 6. So I'm moving up 2 squares to get to 6. And then the 3, which is my delta x, changes my x value. It tells me I am going to add 3 onto x. So right now my x value is 0. So I would add on 3 to get 3. So I basically went 2 squares up and 3 squares over. I added 2 onto my y value, 4 plus 2 is 6, and I added 3 onto my x value, 0 plus 3 is 3. And then I do it again. I'm going to take this point, I'm going to add 2 more onto the y, I'm going to add 3 more onto my x. So I basically move 2 over and 2 up and 3 over. And I keep going until I run out of space and don't have any more room to graph. And then once I've done that, I'm going to go in the other direction. Now, if you are doing this on paper, you can turn your page around 180 degrees, so basically flip it upside down, and then you can keep going 2 up and 3 over, 2 up and 3 over. If, however, you are using Google Docs, you can't turn your screen around, but you are just reversing the pattern, right? So instead of going 2 up and 3 over, we're going 2 down and 3 back. We're just going backwards. And it makes sense to me because if I'm going down 2 that would be -2. And if I'm going back 3, that would be -3. -2 divided by -3 and negative divided by negative makes positive. It's just in case you were interested. So I'm basically just going to follow that pattern backwards, going 2 down and 3 over, going in the opposite direction. And then you are going to take a ruler or a straight edge, whatever you have that will help you draw a straight line. We're going to line it up with our points. And we're going to draw a line. Now your line needs to go from one end of the grid to the other, and you should put arrows to show that it is going to continue. It's just we're only looking at a certain size grid, right? We could have made our grid bigger and the graph would have gone further. So I put the arrows to show that my graph keeps going. So just a quick recap. I used my y-intercept of 4 to start, and then I used the slope of 2 over 3. The 2 tells me how the y is changing. I was adding 2 onto y, or moving up 2, and the x tells me how my x is changing, so I moved 3 squares over, or I added 3 onto x. And we usually are always moving to the right as we're doing this. Very rarely do we go to the left unless we're trying to do the back side of our points. Now we do have one last thing to fill in, which is our x-intercept. So x-intercept is like the y-intercept, except instead of where it crosses the y-axis, it's where it crosses the x-axis. So this crosses the x-axis at -6. So my x-intercept is -6. Right. You can join me in the next video for the next example.